A very beautiful community in the feat of entrepreneurial self-propulsion. The Russian political entertainer and philosophical entrepreneur Alexander Dugin has attacked Mr. Putin's elite. Now, you know that Mr. Dugin isn't necessarily safe either from the Ukrainian or from the Kremlin direction, but he's trying to propel himself with quite a lot of balls, but not many admirable principles, into a position of kind of reputational significance inside Russia that he doesn't currently have. So let's read what he's got to say for himself in his latest verbiage, and then we'll analyze it a bit. And it's good to see you. I've been away for a day or two again because health wasn't compatible even with the chats. But we're still on course for everything, and on course for a couple of main channel videos soon, grounding something you're asking me about a lot, which is the prospect of Trump-Putin negotiations. Now, I'm not excluding Ukraine from this. I'm just saying I'm going to be framing what Putin's thought process might be, and what his biggest fears are around this process. Let's go to Dugin now. Nobody seems to be troubled by the fact that over the past 40 years, more or less the same Russian elite has flipped its ideology many times over into the very opposite of what it was before. This is my loose but quite faithful translation. And it's this comic effect that it actually makes Dugin sound more eloquent than he is in Russian. More or less the same Russian elite has flipped its ideology many times over into the very opposite of what it was before, and done so with an air of wisdom and self-importance. Now they're grey and frail, yet they still continue to lecture a dazed populace about their own incomprehensible ideas. They can't explain to anybody, including to themselves, how a Soviet Komsomol member becomes a liberal becomes an anti-liberal and a patriot, and then, entirely possibly, a liberal and an anti-patriot again. So, what is Dugin doing here? He is doing something in broad brushstrokes, we'll explain in a moment, but in smaller brushstrokes, he's trying to leverage himself into the narrative that the problems Russia faces come from the 1990s. Interestingly, the Duginite internet sphere and the Navalny internet sphere, for very different reasons, are leveraging the same point. And the point is that we've got to repoliticize the 1990s and realize that the Yeltsin era was worse than we thought, right? And the Yeltsin era had many more of the problems there already that Russia faces today. Now, of course, one thing that's worth clarifying is that Dugin doesn't think of Putin as a great leader. He has to have some kind of story about why Putin is necessary. And his story is that Putin is the best transitional leader Russia could possibly have as Russia moves toward what it has to be, which Dugin thinks can't be defined in advance, but somehow will be in good part defined by him in years to come. And so if you told Dugin Putin is the terminus of Russia's historical evolution, Dugin would say Putin is a calamity, he's a disaster, right? So Dugin only accepts Putin as a necessary transitional leader, right? He doesn't think Putin is the great leader that Russia needs, and he's open about that. So a bit of context first before we say some of the bigger brushstroke things. Now, first of all, Dugin leverages his attention in the West to, and if you know me for less than 6 months, this is new to you. If you know me longer, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself. Dugin leverages his attention, his reputation in the West to gain a bit of legitimacy in Russia, and then tries to point Western eyes in the direction of the legitimacy he's gained in Russia as a result of going on in Russia about how important and how respected it is in the West. So the causal arrow at the moment goes from West to Russia, not the other way around, when it comes to Dugin's reputation leveraging. He doesn't want that to be the case 5-10 years from now. I mean, despite his beard, he's only around 60. So he hopes to be around, and he wants to not be a nobody in Russia. And he's trying to go about doing this. Now, the second bit of context that's really important is that my definition of Dugin's activities is really that he is a preemptive follower who, to the superficial gaze, might look like he is a leader. So he's trying to say, well, where is this Putin train going? I'm going to try to be 2 stops ahead of where it is now, waiting for it. Now, the trouble that Dugin has intellectually starts with the fact that he understands 2 elements of Putin's ideology, though what we might take to be a discouragement, he takes an encouragement in respect of these 2 bits of Putinite ideology, but he doesn't understand the third, what I call the third pillar of Putinite ideology. He gets the fascism and he gets the mysticism. He doesn't get the neoliberalism. And, you know, I talk about neoliberalism not as an analytical position, but as a position that simply gives magical primacy, thoughtless primacy to the market. And hyper-neoliberalism gives thoughtless primacy to the market and then declares that the market is any kind of human conflict. So might is right. And Dugin is not observing this neoliberalism in Putin's regime, even though it's there, for the reason that he himself is very much a consumerist entrepreneur. He himself is in many ways a neoliberal and a hyper-neoliberal. Putin needs war. Mark Galeotti might correct us and say escalation. I'm tempted to say war for regime security. Dugin needs war for societal transformation, and he needs societal transformation for the evolution of his position as a thought leader in Russia. This is an entrepreneurial enterprise. And you can think of Dugin, and this is really rude about Zizek, but you can think of Dugin as a Zizek without principles, who's sold himself out to a state the way Zizek hasn't, and sold himself out to a very bad state, as Zizek certainly hasn't. So he's like a Zizek without principles, who is playing a much more high-stakes entrepreneurial game of thought leadership. And the reason I make the comparison is because for me, and Zizek is very nice in many of his views and actually pro-Ukrainian, but in many ways Zizek is an intensification of the very forces of aimless capitalism that much of his work tries to critique. He is just a lower stakes and a much more ethical version of that kind of position than Dugin. Dugin is a kind of a maximally ethically repulsive, maximally unprincipled, but high stakes playing consumerist entrepreneur. Everything Dugin hates about the West, he himself expresses in the worst light and in the greatest intensity right? There is no greater encapsulation of aimless capitalism gone wrong than Dugin's life project. And the way Dugin massages himself through all of his not so much contradictions, but through all of the arbitrary bits of crap that are swimming around in his worldview, is via recourse to the lack of rigor of the worst kinds of postmodernism. Again, a Western enterprise, right? A Western liberatory philosophical movement entirely tied to the value of individual authenticity and self-realization. And Dugin is all about individual self-realization. He just engages in that in a very consumerist rather than a particularly authentic way. But he is into the worst dimensions of postmodernism, and that's illustrated by the fact that the first sentence of this piece he has written, from which I've quoted the main fat paragraph for you, starts with this sentence. In my translation, history is a sequence of semantic blocks referred to as events. Now, I won't say what's philosophically wrong with that, but what I will say is that there is something bogus and obscure about it. The obscurity of this passage is functional, because what Dugin is doing is he is referring to the notion that the question of how relative historical narratives are is a very deep question. He's referring to the depth of that question, of the possible relativity of historical narratives, but without actually saying what he proposes we think about the nature and degree of relativity of historical narratives. That's what that sentence does. It's an announcement of depth followed by intellectual evasion. Lots of love.